So welcome to our featured panel presentation, How Did We Get Here? Changing Approaches to Undergraduate Moral Formation Throughout American History. My name is Kim Kellison. I'm Associate Dean for Humanities and Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences here at Baylor, and I'm pleased to help moderate this panel today. We have two guests, Andrea Turpin and Ethan Schrum, and I'm going to give you a short bio of each. Ethan Schrum is Associate Professor of History and a Faculty Fellow of the Honors College at Azusa Pacific University. He is a historian of modern American thought and holds a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania. His first book, The Instrumental University, Education and Service of the National Agenda After World War II, with Cornell University Press, explains how elite research universities reconceived their missions after World War II, reconfiguring themselves in order to stimulate economic growth and solve social problems. He has also published articles on the history of American universities in numerous journals. Schrum is an Associate Fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, where he held a postdoctoral fellowship from 2011 to 2014. And he is also a member of the Colloquy on Culture and Formation. Our other panelist is a Baylor, I was going to say native, but getting there, right? Andrea Turpin. Andrea Turpin is Associate Professor of History at Baylor University and a resident scholar at Baylor's Institute for the Study of Religion. She holds degrees from Princeton University, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and the University of Notre Dame. Her research focuses on 19th and 20th century American history, especially religious and intellectual history, women's and gender history, and the history of higher education. Andrea is the author of A New Moral Vision, Gender, Religion, and the Changing Purposes of American Higher Education, 1837 to 1917. The book has won 3 awards: the 2018 Biennial Linda Eisenman Prize, did I get it right? Yes. from the History of Education Society, the 2017 Lilly Fellows Program Biennial Book Award, and Baylor University's 2016 Guittard Book Award for Historical Scholarship. So each panelist will speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. And we didn't talk about who's going first, but I assume it's Andrea?
Logically, chronologically.
Perfect.
All right,
so.
Historians love chronology.
Yeah, so.
Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. All right, we historians don't totally love technology, so well, hopefully that works out. So today, Ethan and I are going to tell you a story. It is the story of how we all got here at a conference dedicated to thinking through how to approach undergraduate character formation in 2019. As historians of American higher education, we believe that in order to understand what to do in the future, we need to understand what has happened in the past to bring us to this point. At the same time, we believe that the past does not provide us with an exact blueprint of what to do. Rather, it constitutes a handbook to the debate university administrators, professors, and students have had on this topic at different times, what gave rise to these debates, and what effects their outcomes have had. In a word, history provides wisdom. Specifically, I'm going to tell you the story of how changes in the nature of American higher education, its curriculum, extracurriculum, admission policies, its sense of purpose, required rethinking how to instill character in undergraduates, and whether that was something colleges should even be doing at all. This story is very much bound up in the changing role of religion in American higher education. I'm also going to tell you a second story. History is a fun discipline, if I do say so myself. Because while historians mostly agree on what happened, not entirely, we don't always agree on why. Historians looking at the problem from different angles have offered different explanations, some compatible and some not. So the second story I'm going to tell you is the story of how different historians, in conversation with one another, have tried to make sense of why these changes occurred. This discussion matters because the lessons we draw from the past depend on rightly understanding what exactly caused these changes to undergraduate moral formation. As we think through this story, it can help to keep in mind that there are multiple factors that impinge on undergraduate character development. Here, for example, are 6 broad categories. 1, what kind of a college or university are we talking about? They're not all the same. Was it religious, any specific denomination, public or private or somewhere in between, oriented regionally or nationally, small or large, liberal arts focused or more comprehensive? 2, what population did the college serve? Only men? Only women? Only whites or only blacks? Rich or poor? Religiously homogenous or religiously diverse? Did students sign a statement of faith? How old were students? 3, what was the job of professors at this institution? Teaching? Teaching and student discipline and oversight? Teaching and research? If research in a particular discipline or across multiple disciplines? And by what standard were the results judged? 4, what was the curriculum of the college? Were there required courses? Were there majors? Were there distribution requirements? 5, what actually happened in the classroom at this institution? Did professors open class with prayer? Make direct connections with theology when teaching other subjects? Disagree with one another about the faith? Keep faith out of the classroom? Make direct ethical application? Finally, 6th, and arguably equally important, what happened outside the classroom? Did the institution have required chapel? If so, what actually went on there? Required courses in religious instruction? Were there voluntary religious groups or service organizations? How popular were they? What activities dominated student culture? Think sports, fraternities, right? Did students all live together under the supervision of a mentor of some sort? As we think through these categories, notice that different types of people have had control over different ones of them. University administrators, faculty, religious chaplains, student leaders, and wider cultural expectations that it's hard to pin down exactly who was responsible for. It's the combined effect that creates the conditions for undergraduate moral formation. With these categories in mind, let's begin at the beginning, with the basic story of what has changed over time. The earliest colleges in the United States, for example, Harvard in Massachusetts in 1636, William and Mary in Virginia in 1693, and their various colonial successors, including here Princeton in New Jersey in 1746, where I went, so I put up pretty pictures for you to stare at. Okay, they were all patterned after their European counterparts and were established to bring European civilization to the Americas. Colleges at this time existed to train men, only men, for one of 4 basic things: to be ministers, doctors, lawyers, or more broadly, to be educated gentlemen who could participate in the international community of letters. If you've ever wondered why so many of the American founders could all reference like Roman history, this is why. Only 1 in 1,000 male colonists attended college. During this era and lasting into the early 1800s, the curriculum was nearly completely set and was heavy on the Greek and Latin classics in the original languages, in mathematics, and in philosophy, which included aspects of what we now call science. There was a capstone course in moral philosophy that tied together the curriculum through a Christian theological and ethical lens. Chapel and courses in the evidences for Christianity were both required. Students lived on campus. Students were mostly younger than they are today, which is to say they were teenagers, and faculty engaged in both teaching and in loco parentis student supervision, but not a lot of research. When faculty did engage in research, it was often broad and touched on many fields. Students, meanwhile, engaged in a lot of rebellion. Most colleges affiliated with a particular Protestant denomination, but understood themselves to serve both the church and the state. Most college leaders hoped for a religious revival to sweep through the college at least once every 4 years so every student would have the experience. Revivals were somewhat effective at winning students' hearts. All right. During the 1800s, a number of factors combined to change this landscape. Citizens of the new American Republic rebelled against the perceived elitism of the inherited curriculum, and they demanded more practical education accessible to a wider swath of the populace. College curriculum expanded somewhat as a result, and many new colleges were founded. These tended to be cooperative efforts between a local town government and a Protestant denomination to serve the needs of both. Accordingly, the student body was a combination of local residents and members of that denomination from farther away. In a second case of educational democratization, women's higher education, previously an oxymoron, also exploded. In 1837, the first permanent single-sex institution of higher education for American women opened, Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts. It was not quite college level yet, but would become so after the Civil War. And the first women to ever enter a BA program, I think, in the world, actually did so at coeducational Oberlin College in Ohio the same year, 1837. The founders of both institutions were motivated by what I call evangelical pragmatism, which is to say they believed a conversion experience was necessary to make someone right with God, and that it was therefore important to do whatever it took to get as many people as possible, female and male, poor and rich, communicating the gospel message as well as possible in as many ways as possible so as many people as possible could get saved. Evangelical pragmatists were therefore willing to ignore some cultural norms like the exclusion of women from college in their quest to increase the number of people with trained minds able to communicate the gospel to the next generation, either as teachers or mothers or in whatever other way God might lead them. Some, although not many, even supported women ministers. Out of the same logic, Oberlin actually admitted black students alongside white. Fears of what was called miscegenation, which is to say sex between blacks and whites, dominated this era, so pioneering coeducation alongside biracial education was an extraordinary example of the power of religious belief to change social practice. To return to the expansion of specifically women's higher education beyond these pioneering institutions, many of the women seeking higher education in this century, the 19th, were training to become teachers in America's expanding school system, both public and private. By the middle of the century, state universities increasingly admitted women, largely because it was cheaper than building a separate institution to meet the growing taxpayer demand. Meanwhile, as higher education was democratizing in these ways in the United States, the cutting edge of higher education worldwide was actually Germany. Professors there began focusing more of their time on original research. Breakthroughs, particularly in the sciences of biology and geology, and in the study of texts, led to an explosion of new knowledge that made it more difficult for researchers to continue being generalists. Embracing the German research ideal would therefore end up siloing American college professors into departments divided by academic discipline, which I'm sure is familiar to no one. All these factors combined with theological developments to cause a sea change in American higher education and its place in American life between the Civil War and World War I, or, for those of you who are not American historians, roughly 1865 to 1920. Professors now not only passed down previously accumulated knowledge, what we heard about in the plenary last night, but also engaged in original research. At the new research universities that increasingly arose after the Civil War, professors traded the time spent supervising students outside the classroom for time spent on research. And as they identified more with a specific discipline, their perceived community of peers also shifted away from the institution where they worked to their field of study at large. A theological shift paralleled this academic one. Conversion-oriented evangelical Protestantism, previously dominant within most American institutions of higher learning, was disestablished, as it were, which is to say, many American intellectuals instead embraced a more liberal, what was known as modernist, Protestant theology, which prioritized ethics rather than conversion as the essence of the Christian faith. Together, these two trends led colleges and universities to reevaluate how they pursued their twin traditional obligations to foster students' intellectual and moral development. Educational leaders began to change how they communicated religious and moral values on campus. Debates about the purposes of higher education and how to achieve them subsequently churned from the 1870s through the 1910s. A lot of scholarship on the history of American higher education in the last 30 years has therefore concentrated on this time period, my favorite time period, especially since historians agree that these were the years that served to solidify the basic structures of today's American college and university. So now I want to turn to the second story, how historians have made sense of these changes and their causes and effects. I'll start with a renewed interest in the topic in the 1990s. The engine powering this new train of scholarship was the volume Secularization of the Academy, edited by George Marsden and Bradley Longfield in 1992. In his introduction to the volume, George Marsden set up the historical question the essay sought to answer. Quote, "Our subject is the transformation from an era when organized Christianity and explicitly Christian ideals had a major role in the leading institutions of higher education to an era when they have almost none." Marsden clarified that the book's authors believed secularization had been a gain in some ways. It allowed for more participants in higher education, for example, but a loss in others. The loss he highlighted was that no consensus had emerged as to what would replace the ousted broad Protestantism as a moral underpinning for higher education. The result, he argued, quote, left a moral vacuum that can be filled only by rhetoric and politics. This was 1992. Okay. Goes on. So the modern university, which liberated itself from religious dogmas in order to become a haven for free inquiry, is in danger of becoming largely an arena for political debate based on appeals to dogmatic authority. At the same time, no authority is widely recognized. End quote. Marsden's own 1994 book-length treatment, The Soul of the American University, several of you have probably read this, From Protestant Establishment to Established Non-Belief, made the biggest splash at the time and has had one of the largest ripple effects as well. This work constituted a sweeping interpretation of the changing role of religion in American higher education. It articulated a historical explanation for the secularization of the academy, and in a postscript, a controversial program for creating a more robustly pluralistic modern academy, bless you, in which religious viewpoints would have a seat at the table but not control the discussion. Marsden focused on the effects of the tension between the religious origins of most American colleges and the common understanding that colleges should serve the entire public, that is, students from a variety of faiths, if not always a variety of races, sexes, and class backgrounds. Navigating these realities led higher educational leaders, almost all Christians at the start, to insist that their theological position, and hence their educational institution, was what truly constituted being non-sectarian, which was the goal. In the mid-19th century, broad-minded evangelical college leaders made this argument against smaller denominational schools. Then, in the decades around 1900, liberal Christian scholars used it to take power from the evangelicals. Then, later in the 20th century, secular scholars used it in turn against the liberal Christians. Marsden sought his answers at the top, which is to say, he gave pride of place to the religious convictions of top college and university administrators, whom he believed had the power to set the trajectory of their institutions. He thus spent less time on factors like changing ideals of science, curriculum, or student life. Marsden also focused on the prestigious institutions at the top, what we now call aspirational peers. He thus excluded Catholic colleges and universities, women's colleges, historically black colleges and universities, most Southern colleges and universities, and the conservative Protestant colleges of the 20th century. Marsden was hardly alone in slighting the experience of women or people of color in his history. The other synthetic treatments of the changing role of religion in American higher education written in that decade did not incorporate them much either. Where these other works differed was in their answer to the question of why the role of religion changed. Some, like Marsden, focused on conscious changes by administrators and faculty, concerned with building a position of authority for themselves and their institutions. Others focused more on the ironies of history, that is, the accidental consequences for religion of changes made to higher education for other reasons. And some of these authors paid more direct attention to the effects on students. Jim Burchill traced a similar pattern at many denominational colleges at a delay of a few decades in his 1998 Dying of the Light. Then sociologist Christian Smith tweaked Marsden's argument in his essays in the Secular Revolution in 2003. He highlighted the efforts during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, again, for non-historians, that's 1865 to 1920, just another way of putting it, not just by liberal Christians, but also by explicit secularists, to gain control of the knowledge-making power of the universities by actively working to marginalize the role of religion. In this way, he pushed Marsden's timeline earlier. On the other side of the argument, Julie Rubin maintained in her 1996 The Making of the Modern University, Intellectual Transformation and the Marginalization of Morality, that university leaders did not purposefully uproot moral and religious concerns from the university experience, and neither, she argued, did these concerns wither from neglect. Rather, the growing prestige of science in particular eventually choked them out. University leaders actively tried to graft virtue in science, but in the long run, transmitting religious and moral certainties proved unpredictably incompatible with an empirical scientific method that supposedly precluded suppositions of any sort. Science therefore pushed ethical questions beyond the formal curriculum into the extracurriculum, knowledge separated from morality. Rubin argued that this process advanced in 3 phases. The first, religious stage, as she called it, lasted roughly 1880 to 1910. During this phase, university leaders in the rising research universities prized the scientific approach because they saw it as objective and hence a sure path toward progress. Academic leaders therefore sought to apply this approach to the study of religion in order to reach religious consensus and maintain a religious component within the curriculum. However, practitioners of this approach ultimately put themselves out of business. They concluded that religious truth was emotional and moral, while scientific truth was intellectual. Religion's role in the curriculum thus became problematic, especially because it also turned out in an act of student choice that students had little interest in studying religion that way. 2, Rubin's second phase, the scientific stage, overlapped the first. It lasted roughly 1900 to 1920. Here, scientific referred not to applying the approach of science to religion, as in phase 1, but rather to deriving the perceived benefits of religion from science. In other words, faculty and administrators who took this approach argued that careful scientific study fostered in students the same character traits that liberal Protestantism sought to inculcate: self-discipline, fair-mindedness, cooperation, and the like. Additionally, the scientific study of social problems would fuel social progress. Because liberal Protestantism focused more on instilling character traits and sometimes social change than on transmitting cognitive theological content as specific as that of conservative Protestantism, science could thus serve the ends of religion, without the need to include any of the now problematic formal study of religion in the curriculum. Scientists themselves ultimately killed this approach. For reasons of professional advancement, they did not want their practice tied to moral values that could be seen as non-objective. Now, as an aside, in 2012, historian Andrew Jewett, in his Science, Democracy, and the American University, would question this timeline and argue that advocates of value neutrality in science did not win a clear victory until the mid-20th century, and accordingly, he held out more hope than Rubin that we could recapture in the present the approach of using the principles of science to build moral consensus. Now, returning to Rubin, she labeled the final phase of universities attempting to retain in collegiate education a role for the moral values traditionally fostered by religion as humanistic and extracurricular, and it ran roughly 1915 to 1930. Since scientists rejected the role, administrators turned to the humanities. Seeking a raison d'être during an era that demanded useful knowledge, the humanities argued that they provided students moral guidance through studying the best of human culture. By the 1930s, the humanities, not the sciences, supplied the quintessential freshman introductory course. In other words, the previous phase had tied the good to the true, but this phase tied the good to the beautiful. Just as liberal Protestantism and the scientific study of religion both loosened the link between religion and cognitive truth, so did shifting student moral formation onto the humanities disassociate morality from factual knowledge and associate it instead with aesthetic knowledge. Simultaneously, administrators de-emphasized the role of the curriculum altogether in fostering student moral development. The rise in the early 20th century of the modern apparatus of student life, freshman orientation, student advising, student life administrators, took much of this role instead. By moving moral formation primarily outside the curriculum, administrators completed the process of decoupling morality and knowledge. Educators ultimately released responsibility for their historic role in transmitting moral values to students because they'd come to believe consensus via empirical testing was the standard for truth. Yet, they could not reach moral consensus this way, so ironically, they removed morality from among the university's roles in order to preserve the ideal that free inquiry would always lead to truth. Taking seriously the effects of moving student moral formation outside the classroom, historian David Setron later examined the significance of the Collegiate Young Men's Christian Association, right? YMCA, that one. A wildly popular student, at the time, it was a wildly popular student religious organization with local branches on almost every campus. His book, The College Why, Student Religion in the Era of Secularization, was published in 2007. Setron examined how college administrators in the decades around 1900 turned to voluntary religious organizations, particularly the YMCA and the YWCA. I'll let you figure that one out. Although Setron confined his analysis to the men's organization. These organizations assumed responsibilities for students' moral and religious lives. Setron traced how theological changes within the men's organization, namely a shift from evangelicalism to modernism, contributed to the ultimate secularization of the student experience. In brief, Setron argued that the why shifted from a focus on transmitting theological beliefs, even though it's happening outside the classroom, to encouraging ethical action, eventually so much so that the theological beliefs became optional. John Roberts and James Turner advanced a complementary analysis to Rubin's in The Sacred and the Secular University, 2000. Fun fact, that's also Princeton on the cover. All right. They explored how in the early 20th century, the positive impulse of disciplinary specialization, rather than any overt antagonism toward religion, cordoned off religion from its previous position as the unifier of all knowledge. Previously, science had been conducted in a sort of package approach that linked natural science, natural theology, Christian ethics, and what was known as common sense philosophy, that things are basically as they seem. Likewise, the social sciences and the humanities now sought to produce their own kinds of knowledge unlinked from a wider vision. Thus, as each discipline professionalized and used methodological naturalism for its own ends, religion became increasingly irrelevant to the university project, albeit unintentionally. It was therefore not the rise of the research ideal per se, they argue, which altered the role of religion in American higher education, but rather the commitment to research conducted within narrower disciplinary bounds. Even as Roberts and Turner delved more deeply than Rubin into the role of the humanities in collegiate secularization, they too noted the signal importance of the sciences. For them, this lay in the fact that the sciences succeeded in making the argument that truth was best obtained through, quote, scientific knowledge and ongoing rational inquiry, end quote, rather than by theological presuppositions. In this way, advocates for the natural sciences pushed out alternative epistemologies for truth, including tradition, divine inspiration, and subjective religious experience. So much so, in fact, that the social sciences and the humanities adopted variations of the scientific approach. Higher education did not become hostile to religion per se, they argue, but rather became less concerned with theology as its mission reoriented in a different direction. Now, despite their differences, Rubin, Roberts, and Turner all diagnosed the major loss from the rise of the research university as the fracturing of the good, now limited to service learning and virtue acquisition, the true, now associated only with research and empirically verifiable knowledge, and the beautiful, now covered exclusively in courses on culture and the arts. And strikingly, Rubin ultimately proposed a similar solution as Marsden to the loss of meaningful moral authority by American universities. It was this: universities should stop modeling agreement as the ultimate standard for identifying truth. Rather, they should recognize that important aspects of human life lie outside spheres in which agreement is feasible. Universities should therefore tolerate more conflict and therefore allow for the reintegration of fact and value, now by competing voices, because they can never actually be totally separated, and admitting this fact brings us one step closer to truth. My own contribution to this discussion has been to use both intellectual and social history to analyze the changing role of religion in American higher education, which is to say to weave race, class, or gender as a significant variable throughout the narrative. As far as I know, and I checked this with Ethan, so now I'm blaming him too, I am the only one to have done so in a book-length treatment, which is this, A New Moral Vision, Gender, Religion, and the Changing Purposes of American Higher Education. So there's a lot of opportunity for future research here. My focus was gender and to a lesser extent class, and I made two main interventions. First, I argued that the dominant shift from evangelical to modernist Protestantism on many campuses affected students' sense of personal identity, especially as men and women. To see how this works, it helps to think of evangelicalism as a vertical spirituality that thought that getting right with God by responding to the gospel message and faith would lead to a changed heart that then loved people better on the horizontal plane. And modernism is a horizontal spirituality that thought that focusing first on treating people more morally would then make someone right with God on the vertical plane. Gender identity mattered less in a spirituality that was oriented first toward relating to God and mattered more in one oriented first toward relating to the human community, at least in the culture around 1900 that had some pretty strong gender stereotypes. This is counterintuitive to us because subsequent cultural changes made the surrounding culture today less rather than more gendered than a sort of average person's plain reading of the Bible's teaching on men and women. Second, and related, I argue that historians have missed something important by ignoring that the changing role and nature of religion in American higher education took place concurrently with the entrance of women into higher education on a huge scale between the 1870s and the 1910s. As I mentioned earlier, before the Civil War, evangelical pragmatism provided the main impetus for opening the highest levels of education to women. But the population of female collegians really surged after the Civil War, during the shifting role and type of religion in higher education. During this era, colleges and universities sought to enhance their national reputation by downplaying their denominational or even broadly evangelical identity. And they did it by instead playing up how they contributed to the national good by educating men, women, or both for unique social contributions. In other words, they articulated a new moral vision for their institutions by positioning them within the new landscape of competing men's, women's, and coeducational institutions. In a reverse of present-day ideological alignments, the religiously liberal educators of the progressive era fostered in students a more gendered ideal of character and service than earlier evangelical educators who fostered conversion and left the direction of graduates' future lives to God. Men's new moral formation constituted preparation in the character traits and affinities needed for elite roles in government, business, or education. Meanwhile, women's moral formation fostered a parallel but distinct mental and emotional orientation toward mercy professions, such as settlement work, social work, or nursing, in addition to the ubiquitous vocation of teaching children. Because of this religious reorientation, the widespread entrance of women into higher education did not shift the social order in as egalitarian a direction as we might expect. Instead, college graduates who formed a disproportionate number of the leaders and reformers of the progressive era of the early 1900s contributed to the creation of separate male and female cultures in public life as well as private. Now, to conclude by bringing the story up to the years before World War II, so I can pass it off. Supporting World War I consumed the moral energy of college campuses around the nation. And afterward there, as in the United States at large, a very different moral climate held sway. The student body valued social advancement above social reform. College men and women were now more interested in socializing with one another than in splitting into reform-oriented subcultures. By the 1920s, the public mind clearly linked a college education not only or primarily with moral leadership in government and the professions, but also, and increasingly primarily, with success in business. To manage the greater variety of students, Catholic, Jewish, agnostic, seeking occupational credentials, educational administrations took back the oversight of extracurricular life that they had in part ceded to the YMCA and YWCA, and these Protestant Christian associations could no longer lay claim to being a unifying moral force on campus. They joined a host of new denominational chaplaincies as only a few among a myriad of options, religious and otherwise, available to students in an ever more diverse and fragmented extracurricular life. Thus, Protestant Christianity could still inform the thought of many university leaders, but it would not dominate moral discourse within either the curriculum or the extracurriculum. Ultimately, the fractured collegiate subcultures of the 1920s and beyond more easily incorporated students of different beliefs, backgrounds, and interests. It's not an entirely bad thing, though many institutions still restricted initial admission to one sex, race, or class. Additionally, that decade's lack of a coherent moral vision for the uses of a college education effectively encouraged considering a wider range of future employment opportunities. But the loss of the ethical edge that characterized the various earlier campus climates provided less motivation to orient education towards service and also less impetus to open new fields to women. Before I pass the rest of the story off to Ethan, let me conclude with a few of the things I see from the story thus far. 1, there are 3. There is more than one way of knowing, but the university as currently constructed is geared toward one of them, methodological naturalism, which is to say what we can know through agreed upon, reproducible observation and rational analysis. Facts ascertainable this way, whether they be facts of history or physics, intersect with the questions of ultimate truth and values, but they do not exhaust those spheres. Therefore, university learning alone cannot suffice to ground students' identities and ethical compass. They must be combined with teaching that derives from other modes, such as, for example, religious or philosophical traditions or spiritual or transcendent experiences. These teachings cannot be agreed upon in the same way, and this fact suggests that we either need institutional pluralism, elective options in this sort of instruction, or competing extracurricular opportunities for this type of moral and religious formation, or all of them. 2, character can be built in the classroom, just like it can be built in any sphere of work, but the classroom is not necessarily unique here, nor is any particular academic discipline. In other words, we should do this, but it is not enough. Students still need the cognitive content of a life philosophy to provide identity and direction. 3rd and finally, absent cognitive and ethical grounding in something truly ultimate, like a specific set of beliefs about God or ultimate reality, and some sort of relationship with God or deeply experienced obligation to the wider world outside oneself, then institutions and their students will necessarily substitute some lesser identity and sense of purpose. Be that embodying a social ideal of masculinity or femininity, seeing oneself primarily as a wage earner, seeking self-actualization, etc. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Great to see many of you. Thanks to my APU colleagues for showing up this morning. Great to see my dear friend Drew Trotter from the Consortium of Christian Study Centers, very important organization for moral formation today. Thanks to Andrea for the idea for this panel. So I am going to pick up the story in post-World War II, and of course I have a much easier task than Andrea, who had to deal with 309 years. I only have to deal with 74 years, and I get just as much time, or almost as much time. So I was reading the Chronicle of Higher Education one day a few months ago, and I saw this article saying something like, you know, in the midst of all this doom and gloom, I want to argue, this article said, that American universities are actually stronger than ever. So I looked at this article, and it was written by Stephen Brint, who's a distinguished sociologist of higher education. I was familiar with some of his earlier work. And as I scanned the article, I learned that it was an excerpt from a book, so I went and got the book, which is called 2 Cheers for Higher Education: Why American Universities Are Stronger Than Ever and How to Meet the Challenges They Face. So his book says it's tracing the trajectory of American higher education from 1980 to 2015 and making the claim that universities are in a better position than ever before. So how does one define such things? What are the criteria for making such a judgment that universities are in a better position? Well, as I looked at the book, I found that his criteria had little, if anything, to do with moral formation. The criteria include monetary measurements. He pointed out that research funding and financial aid are both greater than ever. He cites improvements in economic development, in health and technology that universities have spurred. He does speak of, quote, the possibilities for more complete personal development, for the time and challenges to become deeper, more creative, more reflective people. But as far as I could tell, that's about as far as he gets to anything moral. The index contains 0 references to the terms character, moral, or any kind of thing using moral as a modifier, or virtue. So in this book, which claims to be about how great the American university is today, there is very little attention to moral formation. So I think that's kind of symptomatic. And that's the kind of book that prompts you to ask the title of this panel, how did we get here? How did we get here from a world of 19th century colleges that gave great emphasis to forming virtue in their students? Andrea has given the first part of that answer, and I aim to shed a bit of further light on the issue by examining the years after World War II. I'm going to take a different approach. I don't think there's really a way to cover this topic, so to speak. There are many programs of many sorts that happened in specific places. One can only trace patterns and give snapshots that might have wider ramifications. I'm really going to focus mainly on one very important leader of American higher education, Clark Kerr. And I'll get to him in a minute. So I'm going to look at some of the conditions that impacted moral formation, maybe some conditions that brought challenges for moral formation. I want to emphasize that I'm speaking primarily about elite research universities in this talk. I'm not really talking about liberal arts colleges or Christian institutions, for instance. And I'm going to focus on the conditions for moral formation that arose out of a new understanding of the university's mission that I have dubbed the Instrumental University in my recent book by that title, published by Cornell University Press. So what did the Instrumental University mean for the possibilities for moral formation? At a minimum, the advent of this model distracted university leaders from the project of forming the character of undergraduates through classroom teaching. It also changed the moral connotations for research. Proponents of the Instrumental University minimized the explicit connection of research to character formation, and instead framed research as primarily oriented towards stimulating economic growth and solving social problems. Still, even within this model, we see some attempts at redefining character formation, and I'm going to share one that Clark Kerr suggested. Kerr was president of the University of California from 1958 to 67. His background was as a scholar of industrial relations. And he proposed redefining liberal arts education for the industrial era. And this is sort of a preview of something I'm going to get into more deeply, but in what he saw as an increasing era of leisure and consumerism, he argued that liberal education should prepare students to use their leisure well and consume discriminatingly, because the individual's liberty to make consumer choices might be one of his most essential freedoms. So I'm going to talk a lot about Clark Kerr and the movement he represented, and then finish up with a few other strands relevant to moral formation. So I wanted to follow up on one thing that Andrea indicated. This is when she was talking about Julie Rubin's book and the second phase that Rubin identified, which is that scientific practices could themselves instill character. I was intrigued to find a great explication of that view as late as 1947.
Backing up Jewett.
That's right, backing up Andy Jewett's ideas. So this is the American Council on Education Committee on Religion and Education. In 1947, it wrote, "The discipline of the scientific method has a definitely ethical quality. It requires fidelity to truth, the subordination of private motives, the suppression of bias, active cooperation with colleagues in the work of investigation, and, at its best, the making available of the results for public use." These are the virtues of the scientific method for moral formation, according to this group. And other scholars, such as Daryl Hart, Owen Hanaway, and Michael Dennis, have shown that earlier at Johns Hopkins, which was founded in 1876 and was kind of the emblematic American research university for the first few decades after its founding, that these kind of ideals about moral formation through research were dominant over more technical conceptions of the research enterprise. So for instance, Ira Remsen, prolific chemist, mentored more chemistry PhDs than anyone else in America in the early years, eventually became president of Hopkins, saw chemistry more as a moral formation than a technical discipline. That's something that would change after World War II. It started to change earlier, but could be seen more dramatically after World War II as university leaders focused more on the cultural importance of technique. And it's in that connection that we'll turn to Clark Kerr. Scholars generally consider Kerr the most influential leader of American higher education since World War II, and there are several reasons for that status. As I mentioned, he served as president of the nation's largest university system, the University of California, during the headiest years of its post-war boom, leading the creation of new campuses at Irvine, San Diego, and Santa Cruz in the early 1960s. He brokered the California Master Plan for Higher Education in 1960, which landed him on the cover of Time magazine and won international acclaim. 3 years later, he published his book, The Uses of the University, which I'll refer to multiple times. 1963 came out of a lecture series at Harvard, the Godkin Lectures. He later expanded this book through 5 editions, the last one coming out in 2001, just 2 years before his death. Many people consider this book the definitive analysis of the post-war university by a participant. After leaving the UC presidency, he was basically shoved out by Ronald Reagan when Reagan became governor. Kerr went on to spend 13 years leading 2 Carnegie bodies that produced a plethora of research on American higher education and created the Carnegie classification system that we're familiar with today, R1, R2, etc. So my new book, The Instrumental University, provides the most detailed account of the intellectual history of Clark Kerr and his context. And it shows how he drew from some of the most prominent currents of thought in his era while advancing others, and how other university leaders took up his ideas. One of the things for which Kerr is most known is popularizing the term multiversity. Anybody heard that term, multiversity? Good. So that was in his book, The Uses of the University. And he said that after World War II, the research university had become the multiversity because it engaged in a spectacular array of activities with little cohesion and no unifying philosophy. He did not deplore the multiversity, and in fact gave it a largely optimistic gloss. And he joked that the multiversity could be described as a series of individual faculty entrepreneurs held together by a common grievance over parking. As Chancellor, Kerr had overseen the removal of many of the central parking lots from the Berkeley campus. So we will return to how the multiversity was connected to the unity of knowledge and moral formation, but right now I want to look at how it pushed students into the mold of consumers, which became an important strand of implicit character formation in the post-war research university. And of course, treating students as consumers has just proliferated all the more since Clark Kerr's time, and we see this in all sorts of ways in institutional procedures in our universities. So in a famous passage in Uses, Kerr said the following: "The multiversity is a confusing place for the student. He has problems of establishing his identity and sense of security within it. But it offers him a vast range of choices, enough to literally stagger the mind. In this range of choices, he encounters the opportunities and the dilemmas of freedom. The casualty rate is high. The walking wounded are many. Lernfreiheit, the freedom of the student to pick and choose, to stay or to move on, is triumphant." This passage would have been music to the ears of Charles W. Eliot, the titanic figure of the late 19th century, who spent 40 years as president of Harvard. Eliot typically gets credit for spreading the elective system, throughout American academia. And he did so based on the belief that the elective system provided students with an essential kind of formation for a free society. Namely, that students needed to practice their liberty by making choices about which courses should constitute their undergraduate education and learning from their inevitable mistakes. Now, this notion of choice is, of course, important in the broad liberal tradition. Think of the rational individual, the autonomous moral agent making choices. But choice is even more central to a consumer mentality. And to see how Kerr linked such a consumer mentality to moral formation, I would like to spend a few minutes examining one of his speeches. I find it fascinating how much we can learn about American higher education by studying a few lines of one Clark Kerr speech. He became president, as I said, of the multi-campus University of California in 1958, which meant he had to go around and give inaugural addresses at all the campuses. He was even, this is my favorite part, he was even inaugurated as commander-in-chief of the university's fleet of seagoing vessels in a shipboard ceremony at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego. But I would like to focus on his inaugural address at UC Riverside. Now, one key context for this speech is that at the time he was preparing these inaugurals, he was also completing the manuscript for his major work in industrial relations titled Industrialism and Industrial Man. Kerr was the lead author for this collaborative book involving 3 other top industrial relations scholars, which the Ford Foundation funded to the tune of several $100,000, equivalent to millions today. It was an audacious book. The authors intended nothing less than to challenge Karl Marx by offering a new world historical account of economics and society. And they went on a round-the-world trip to promote this book. The book portrayed the world's societies as marching inexorably toward industrialism. And it's, in the broader scholarly conversation, the book is sometimes classified as an example of modernization theory. So as Kerr was preparing his inaugurals, he was drafting a chapter of the book titled The Logic of Industrialism. So he argued that industrialism was a logic that was sort of inexorably moving across the earth. And his ideas carried over to how he framed the University of California's future in his Riverside inaugural, titled Education for the 21st Century. Notable title, very forward-looking. He began with the argument that 2 great forces, industrialization and the explosion of knowledge, were, quote, very important quote, producing changes in everyday life so drastic and fundamental and affecting so many people that it is no exaggeration to say we are entering a new era in the history of mankind. This statement exemplified Kerr's tendency to see world historical forces shaping universities. Later in his career, he published a book titled Higher Education Cannot Escape History. I want to highlight 2 really important things about this statement by Kerr. First, it exhibits a tendency we see a lot today in commentary about higher education, which is the tendency to think that one is living through an utterly transformative time. We find examples of this when we read the Chronicle of Higher Education, when we read the proponents of so-called disruptive innovation in the strategic planning process at my own university. One of the manifold benefits of studying history is that it helps us to escape the blinders of our own present moment. Yes, higher education is changing today. It's always changing. But is it really changing as fundamentally as it did in the late 19th century when, as Andrea has told us, the whole system really did fundamentally change? And I think that this being obsessed with thinking that one is living through some utterly new thing has a tendency to lead us astray in moral formation, among other things. The second important thing in Kerr's statement is a kind of deterministic view of history. And Kerr explained this view elsewhere by saying that the university, quote, has a reality rooted in the logic of history. It is an imperative rather than a reasoned choice. Now, in the audience at Riverside that day, maybe even on the platform, was the great sociologist Robert Nisbet, founding dean of the College of Letters and Science at Riverside. a friend of Kerr and previously his faculty colleague at Berkeley. Now, despite their friendship, Nisbet had a starkly different view of how we should see the relationship of universities to history, which he later articulated in his book with the amazing title, The Degradation of the Academic Dogma. This book argued that the American university had lost its way in the quarter century after World War II by succumbing to what he coined academic capitalism. If you're familiar with the later scholarship on academic capitalism by Sheila Slaughter et al., know that Robert Nisbet used the term 25 years earlier. In Nisbet's notion, research became entrepreneurial and managerial and increasingly disconnected from both teaching and the traditional social structure of the university. I was thinking last night how Nisbet would have appreciated Elizabeth Corey's talk. Nisbet believed that the key step in rehabilitating the American university was to reject the prevailing assumption that, in his words, some indwelling pattern of development exists and that planning for the university must be in accord with this pattern. Such thinking, according to Nisbet, downplayed traditional practices and labeled new university activities as inevitable or modern, thus giving them the imprimatur of being good. Now, Kerr's view of history influenced the main thrust of his Riverside address, which examined the educational implications of what he called 5 imperatives of the logic of industrialization. So remember that he says the university is sort of beholden to these imperatives. He expected higher education to conform to these imperatives rather than standing outside of them and providing alternatives. And I'm going to discuss 3 of these imperatives here. The first imperative was industrialism's extreme proliferation of specialized occupational tasks. And that meant that society would need, and I want you to listen to this quote very carefully, enormous numbers of skilled personnel trained in scientific, technical, and administrative techniques, and this training will have to be very highly specialized. Sometimes I can hardly believe that Kerr used the adjective technical to modify the noun techniques in a University of California inaugural address. But I think the notion of technical techniques exemplifies this mindset and how thoroughly instrumental it was. The idea that universities must provide society with people adept at highly specialized technical techniques says a lot about how virtue got crowded out. Kerr's prescription is a long way from saying that the university's purpose is to form wise, virtuous persons. The second of Kerr's imperatives of the logic of industrialization that I will mention was the growth of large-scale organizations. They required, in his words, a tremendous array of executive talent to manage the many centers of power. Because each power center related to the rest, these managers must be generalists, and thus they must receive a liberal education, including some rigorous study of the history and methodology of science. Now, on that point, Kerr followed former Harvard President James Conant. I've seen evidence that they conversed, and I would like to follow up on that at another time. The last of the imperatives that I'll mention is the increasing complexity of society. Now, here Kerr made an interesting jump, informed by both his longstanding concern for preserving individual liberty and the public debate over the conformist perils of mass society that had followed the publication of William White's book, The Organization Man, 2 years earlier. In a society of increasing complexity, Kerr said, individuals might stick to a group for comfort. Liberal education could broaden horizons, thus helping students to place these commitments in the perspective of larger societal needs, and to realize that one must protect individual rights from intrusions of private associations, as well as from the state. His old friend Nisbet, the great 20th century champion of the importance of voluntary associations for a free society, must have seethed inside again. Kerr then moved to how university leaders must redefine liberal education for the age of industrialism. He stated that industrialism would continue to fuel ever-rising productivity and standards of living, telling the Riverside audience that even before the year 2000, the 4-day work week will become a reality for most of us. As a result, he said, universities should provide students with the resources and incentives to reap the rich benefits of our new leisure and the wealth of our material products. Conformity can be a problem in the cultural sphere as well as elsewhere. Mass production can lead all too easily to indiscriminate mass consumption. Kerr's precise meaning was elusive, but it seems that he wanted the University of California to teach students how to consume material goods discriminatingly. He did not apparently think liberal education should cause students to question the framework of consumption and its centrality for life. And this reading of Kerr is buttressed by another of his 1958 speeches, in which he said, David Reisman has noted that consumption is replacing production as the channel for individual self-expression. Indeed, the individual's freedom of choice as a consumer is perhaps the most immediately effective freedom that he has. Kerr observed that liberal education might, quote, improve the quality of such consumer choices. 6 years later, during the campus uprising known as the Free Speech Movement, UC Berkeley students would revolt against, among other things, the notion that the university should teach students how to be satisfied with material well-being. I want to move now to another key issue for moral formation that Kerr addressed, the unity of knowledge, which is connected to the unity of the university. Joseph Clare, in his recent book on Augustine and education, has reminded us of Augustine's belief that the unity of all knowledge, grounded in God's creative action, was essential for moral formation because, according to Clare, it allows one to recognize one's place in and responsibility to the order of things. Teachers must show the inherent connection of all things in order to form the character of their students. The research university, of course, has a long-standing problem with the unity of knowledge. By the beginning of the 20th century, some educators were protesting what they saw as the fragmentation of knowledge produced by the rise of academic disciplines that Andrea talked about, and the attendant emphasis on specialization, as well as the concurrent shift in undergraduate education to the elective system, and the practice of students majoring in a particular discipline. And the protest against this transformation coalesced into the general education movement by the 1920s. But attitudes toward the unity of the university took an important new turn after World War II. Kerr admitted in his book, The Uses of the University, that knowledge is now in so many bits and pieces, and that the fragmentation of knowledge into endless subdivisions was bad for undergraduates. He stated that a major task is to create a more unified intellectual world, but he worried that it was a very long way off. Now, at the time he wrote those words, he was actually making some efforts toward this goal at two of the new UC campuses, strongly at Santa Cruz and moderately at Irvine. In his memoir, The Gold and the Blue, he admitted that these plans for intellectual integration did not come to fruition. He blamed what he said was a shift of students to a labor market vocational orientation and a shift of faculty tastes increasingly to the multiversity model. Now, one of the major arguments in my book is that elite research universities increasingly conceived of themselves as instruments for spurring economic development and solving social problems. And these goals were connected to the unity of knowledge issue by prominent leaders of the era. So for instance, other higher education leaders latched on to Kerr's concept of the multiversity. Gaylord Harnwell, a renowned physicist and transformational president of the University of Pennsylvania, used the concept of the multiversity to express the idea that the university could be unified by focusing on social problems. He told his trustees in 1966 that he wanted to bring, quote, together our diverse faculties and our cosmopolitan student body into a more closely knit community, welding a multiversity into a true university, capable of responding as one great organism to society's needs, end quote. He believed that shared action could unite the university where shared belief had proven elusive. Indeed, he had been saying similar things since he began as president in 1953. That fall, he told Penn's students at an opening convocation that a university is a community of men and women united in their concern with the significant problems of men and devoted to the acquisition and dissemination of knowledge relative to these problems. This practice of defining knowledge in relation to human problems rather than anything ultimate was, of course, the approach promoted by the celebrated philosopher John Dewey. Related to this idea that the university could be unified by a focus on social problems was a post-war fixation with the concept of direct service. As I plowed through boxes of speeches by university leaders in various archives, Andrea's laughing because she's done the same, the frequent use of the phrase direct service struck me. What does that have to do with moral formation? We need to understand how this approach to service differed from previous ones. Now, the idea that the university should serve its various publics was, of course, nothing new. It had been a dominant theme in American higher education since the founders of Harvard in 1636 charged the college to prepare learned Christian ministers for its community. The feature that distinguished the instrumental university was not the idea of service, but the kind of service that academic and social elites pushed it to provide. They wanted universities as institutions to provide what many of them called direct service by engaging public problems, often through organized research. In other words, let's gather a group of faculty, maybe from different disciplines, around such social program, set up a center or an institute, get some outside funding, and we're going to tackle this social problem. And I think that comes into sharper light when we contrast it with an older model nicely articulated by Woodrow Wilson. When he was president of Princeton around the turn of the 20th century, he talked about a university serving society. He liked to talk about service a lot, gave speeches with service in the title, very famous speeches. But universities would do so, according to Wilson, by educating wise and virtuous leaders with intellectual breadth and vision, not by doing research on social problems. Princeton graduates, he said, should be able to distinguish permanent tendencies from those which are of the moment merely, and promises from threats, knowing the life men have lived, the hopes they have tested, and the principles they have proved. So Wilson's concept had a lot in common with the 19th century college and its moral philosophy framework. Wilson valued scholarship. He helped to start Princeton's graduate school, but he believed it should concentrate on what he called pure studies, not research on particular social problems. But as he talked about Princeton in the nation's service, he focused on broad undergraduate education in the liberal arts and sciences as the university's chief contribution to the nation's service. Even when he said that the university should be directly serviceable to the nation, he believed the path to that goal was to make our men reading and thinking men. Another post-war trend that threatened the unity of knowledge was an increased tendency to frame knowledge as a commodity, something economically valuable, even an object of desire for industrial corporations. In the uses of the university, Kerr followed the Princeton economist Fritz Machlup, who talked about university research as part of a knowledge industry. Kerr observed, sometimes industry will reach into a university laboratory to extract the newest ideas almost before they are born. Instead of waiting outside the gates, agents are working the corridors. This commodification has increased greatly since the 1960s, when Kerr made that observation, spurred by developments such as the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. This law gave universities ownership of patents arising from federally funded research grants, which allowed universities to reap revenues from many more patent licenses. By 1990, nearly all universities had created offices to help patent discoveries made on campus. There's now an extensive literature on commodification, corporatization, and academic capitalism. Some of these works, notably Jennifer Washburn's book, University Incorporated, explore the moral issues that have arisen from the more intense relationships that have developed between corporations and academic researchers since the 1960s. How does this system contribute to the moral formation of university researchers? So when we're thinking about character development, it's not just the students, but also the faculty. How are they being formed by the structures of the contemporary research university? What is their sense of knowledge and its purpose? What is knowledge for? I want to move now toward conclusion by talking just briefly about a few other important strands. So there was an attempt in the post-war era to talk about education as transmitting the moral and spiritual values of our cultural heritage to the next generation, and perhaps becoming a bulwark of liberal democracy by doing so. This approach had some energy immediately after the war because there was so much trauma from the rise of totalitarianism, from the Nazis, the realization that perhaps our intellectual defenses for democracy had become inadequate. Of course, during World War II, there was a whole range of reports poured forth from presses about democracy in higher education, most famously the Harvard Red Book, General Education in a Free Society. Also, President Truman's Commission on Higher Education published its report, Higher Education for American Democracy. The American Council of Learned Societies, the Association of American Colleges, everybody had a report on democracy in higher education in that era. Some university leaders took up this charge, usually ones who came out of the humanities. University of Michigan President Harlan Hatcher, an English professor, Vanderbilt University Chancellor Harvey Branscombe, a New Testament scholar. Some of them tried to implement things along these lines, but this vision tended to falter in the 1960s alongside the ebbing belief in a unified cultural heritage. I do think one important thing coming out of these discussions is that democracy itself can't be an end, but rather a means to more important ends. And I talk about this in my 2007 article, Establishing a Democratic Religion, which is about the President's Commission on Higher Education, where I analyze the philosophical ideas behind the President's Commission and in some of the responses to it. Another important book, recent book, is Jamie Cohen-Cole's book, The Open Mind, Cold War Politics and the Sciences of Human Nature. And he offers an argument for how a number of American academics portrayed what he calls the right kind of mind to be developed in young people in the post-war era. He said that these scholars encouraged the development of the open-minded self, characterized by autonomy, creativity, and the use of reason. And he says this is connected to the post-war rage for interdisciplinarity. He says, for instance, by emphasizing the capacity of researchers in different fields to cooperate, interdisciplinary work exemplified American pluralism. More strikingly, the term interdisciplinary came to refer not just to research, but to a type of person. In his words, it marked the individual as creative, practical, open-minded, tolerant, and scientific. The interdisciplinary person was thus an ideal citizen in American democracy. That connection to civic formation. Finally, I want to wrap up with mentioning very briefly two more recent developments that I see as challenges for character formation in the university. First of all, the growth of vocational majors. This is something that Kerr mentioned as having caused problems for what he tried to implement at UC Santa Cruz, for instance. There's a book by Victor Farrell called Liberal Arts at the Brink. Came out about 8 years ago, maybe. He's a former president of a liberal arts college in the Midwest, and he traces with a lot of statistics how even at liberal arts colleges over the preceding decades, students have increasingly shifted to vocational majors. And so many of these colleges, of course, do good jobs of trying to weave ethical and character concerns into those vocational majors, but with a weaker grounding in the liberal arts, it's possible that these students will leave with less ability to identify and, where necessary, resist the broad intellectual frameworks that are informing their professions. The second more recent trend is highlighted in books such as Gay Tuckman's Wannabe U, as in short for Wannabe University. It's a sociological examination of the University of Connecticut, as well as in Ben Ginsberg's book, The Fall of the Faculty. So the trend they're talking about is an increasing marginalization of the faculty from a lot of areas of institutional operations, a reducing of trust in the faculty, what Tuckman calls, citing Michael Power, the rise of an audit culture, in which faculty are expected to jump through a lot more hoops to give evidence of what they're doing in the classroom. And of course, the craze for outcomes and assessment is one of the great markers of this movement. And I would argue that the outcomes and obsession, the obsession with outcomes and assessment causes problems, especially when there's a demand for outcomes that are measurable. Because when we're talking about moral formation, I think of some great recent work in my own discipline of history, talking about the ways that history should form students with empathy and humility. Well, how do you measure those things? I mean, we can state that we might like them to be outcomes. I prefer to say maybe they're goals or aspirations. But how do you measure those things? So when the most important things are not measurable, that creates some problems. And so with that, I think I will stand down and open things up for your questions.
So we have about 12 minutes for questions.
Thanks for those great talks that complemented each other so well. You guys didn't mention institutions like the National Science Foundation or like the Niebuhr Bush. I wonder if it's plausible to think that science in the service of the Cold War has anything to do with the decline of that great old argument that it was the natural sciences that were going to be the bearers of virtue. Because I agree that argument stuck around for a long time. You see echoes of it in C.P. Snow in the late 50s, which is a sort of rehearsal of that great argument between Matthew Arnold and T.H. Huxley. But those parties really did believe that science was the way to generate a criticism of life, in Arnold's term, and a respect for truth. Where did that argument go? What happened to it?
So this is more your field, but I'll briefly say, so Andrew Jewett, in the book that I cited, one of the things he briefly taught, well, I'm briefly going to tell you what he not briefly talks about, let's put it that way, is that in his changed timeline, the thing that undoes the value ladenness of science and moves it to a value neutrality is the constant emergencies of the 1930s through the 1950s. So like the Depression, the war, the Cold War, right? So then it becomes obvious to people, in a sense, what science is for, like, oh, we should help it address these emergencies. And then that's the thing that removes the ethical reflection from it. And then that's also what ultimately will cause the 60s critique of it. It's become co-opted into a project that perhaps it's not as obvious that this is ethical as we thought. So that's like the very brief answer.
Yeah, I take that in another direction, that the rise of government funding agencies created what Kerr calls the Federal Grant University in Chapter 2 of Uses of the University. And in Nisbet's analysis, that was kind of disastrous for the social structure of the university because it made faculty into entrepreneurs, and it dissociated them from, as I said, the social structure of the university and kind of the lines of moral authority and thinking about their responsibility mainly to an institution and the kinds of formation that went on in that institution. They could see themselves more as creating knowledge for these external needs rather than for the formation of students.
I was just going to make some observations and ask a bit of a question about how you frame the relationship between the goals, aspiration, and vision for higher education and questions of occupations. So I'll start back. I think when Oberlin first accepted women, there was actually a separate curriculum in home economics in 1837.
Yes and no. Oberlin accepted women in 1833 when it was founded, and there was a separate curriculum. In 1837, women were admitted to the male BA curriculum, and that's the distinction.
So they flipped. So the initial intersection was with some kind of perceived occupational, even non-paid work frame for women. And then, I guess one of the things I want to assert is that to some degree, there has always been an occupational undercurrent of some sort, because in the 1800s, we're educating people to become pastors, doctors, lawyers, and it didn't go away, it just morphed in terms of the types of occupations that were involved. So if you even look at the 1960s, people say, well, that was a very liberal arts and sciences era. Well, students, the undergrads, were all encouraged to go to graduate school because their occupation could become a future university professor, because there was huge demand for university professors then. So I guess, I'm not sure if you look at, in certain ways, how detached occupation and other vision for the university enterprise is. And then I guess I would also encourage us not now to think about applied fields of study as vocational programs. Vocation is a larger concept.
Right.
Absolutely.
As it's being used now in American higher education. Vocation is those questions of meaning and purpose and value and who are you called to be. They're occupation specific programs. And I share your concern about the marginalization of the liberal arts in relation to occupation programs. It's just a caution about the terminology we use.
Yeah, it's a good point. I was too closely sticking to the terminology of the people I was reporting on there. Yeah.
And I would briefly just say, I think that you're absolutely right. What we see is a comparative weight issue. Like, you don't go to college at all in the colonial era if you don't want to be one of those four things. But the way that you were formed for those four things were the same, right? It's making you into a certain kind of person. And even in the middle of the 1800s, James McCosh, Scottish minister, president of Princeton, was telling his graduates in their baccalaureate sermon, let God lead you to what you're going to do. So it was a very, you're being sort of like Wilson's quote. I don't like Wilson, but I agree with his quote. I'm not going to lie. But you're forming people in a certain way in order to be able to do this, versus we are forming you in a, giving you very specifics. Yeah, it's a narrow, broad thing. But sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I think David has his hand up and we'll continue.
Thank you. Can I ask what the prevailing view of the history of American higher education before Marsden was? I wonder if Richard Hofstadter has a lot to do with it, and whether that has left an enduring legacy.
Yes. Richard Hofstadter and then Frederick Rudolph, writing the synthetic work in the 60s based off of some of Hofstadter's work earlier. So the American College and University, I believe, the title of Rudolph's work. So Hofstadter's basic claim here, having to do with the 1800s, was an anti-intellectual backlash. has stuck in many people's minds, right? And that's associated with the proliferation of denominational colleges. So that particular narrative went, there were too many of them, we were wasting our resources. This was written in the middle of the 20th century drive for efficiency, right? And they had a low academic quality, and they had these required classes that nobody liked. People like Roger Geiger and a number of other scholars, even earlier in the 1970s, pushed back about that, did a lot of research on it against Hofstadter, and concluded really the 1800s was far more dynamic. And what I gave you as the fusion of the local interests and the denominational interests in a way that worked for both is the dominant understanding of what was going on at that time now, as against Hofstadter.
Yeah, Geiger's book on the 19th century college is very good on that.
Yeah. That would be the reference. It's an edited volume, and it collects some of that work. Yeah.
Just on your couple conclusions, I was intrigued by them, and I want to just throw out a thought here. There's a sense in which particular sort of vocations, anything you get a job with after your major, like a social work, engineering, whatever, those are less moral, and the liberal arts are really what help you form you morally. In my experience of studying curriculum, a lot of those majors, particularly like business or journalism, they have ethics courses. And it's really, when I interview students, it's the sciences that are the moral wasteland. I mean, there are these big courses, there are weed out courses, they're tempted to cheat because everybody's cheating in the classes. And so I'm not sure that we think the liberal arts are so formative, the curriculum of sciences, I'm not so sure.
I think what I was trying to say, I was trying to tie back to the Joseph Clare interpretation of Augustine and seeing the importance of seeing things in a bigger picture, and that the liberal arts provide breadth, and that specifically professional programs are not so focused on breadth. I wasn't denying that they have ethics courses or things like that.
Especially in the sciences, they don't take history of science.
Yeah.
They don't, Harloss is famous to say most of those, pastors know more about the history of science often than scientists do.
That's interesting. It's my undergraduate major, history of science, yeah.
We have time for one more question, and get your into the back, please. Oh, it's you. Okay.
Thank you for two very interesting engaging talks. It seemed like one of the themes from both of your talks is that a certain vision of the scientific enterprise, especially its reliance on some need for free inquiry, seemed initially to push morality out of the curriculum or somehow sideline it or export it. I'm wondering, at what point in the timeline did things like ethics committees come in in universities and started reviewing what scientists were doing, which may not be a very morally substantial kind of phenomenon, but at least give some kind of expression to the idea that maybe even what the researchers are doing, right? So not about the student formation, but what the researchers are doing is something that needs some kind of moral check. Where in the timeline?
Yeah, I should know, but I think it was after the 1970s, in or after the 1970s. I don't have the specifics of when the IRB protocol was created. Now, right after World War II, of course, there was a very strong discourse about the morality of science triggered by the atomic bomb. But that was a bit more broadly within the culture. It might have some help back here.
Well, no, just the whole idea of the IRB, it seems to me that is more driven by federal regulations and civil rights issues than with any particular interest of morality or ethics within the disciplines. Am I wrong in that?
No, that sounds accurate. Yeah.
If you have other questions, you can come up and talk to the speakers individually. Let's thank our panelists.
Thank you.